Thanks for joining, everyone. We're just going to give it a few minutes and then we'll go ahead and get started. Hey, everyone, thanks for joining. We'll get started in a few minutes. All right. We're still going to have, I think, folks trickling in the next few minutes, but we have a bunch of really awesome stuff to cover today. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Hope. I'm a senior program manager here at the Violence Prevention Institute, and I'm so excited to welcome Dr. Lolita Moss and Dr. Samantha Francois to join us today and talk about youth violence exposure, firearm access, and firearm beliefs. Dr. Moss is an assistant professor here at Tulane and is an interdisciplinary social scientist with youth development practice experience, as well as social work and developmental psychology training. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Moss. And then Dr. Francois is coming from Clark University, also a developmental scientist with expertise in adolescent development, structural violence, and anti-racist research. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll hand it over to you guys and we can go ahead and get started.
Thank you so much, Hope, and good afternoon to everyone joining us today. I will go ahead and share my screen so that you have a visual to go along with our conversation. Why is that not working now?
You're already sharing. You can just hit the slideshow.
Okay, thank you. All right, here we go. All right, so good afternoon, everyone, again. As mentioned, our talk is centered on the topic that appears on the title slide, Youth Violence Exposure, Firearm Access, and Firearm Beliefs. And this is, we're presenting an overview of a paper for which we have the citation available at the end of the slide that we encourage you all to read and cite freely as it is relevant to your work. So a bit of background and ground setting for the focus of the research and the focus of our conversation today is we want to sort of situate folks understanding in the context of New Orleans, where this research study takes place, and in particular experiences with and exposures to gun violence in terms of residents' experiences and exposures. And in order to illustrate this, we wanted to provide some headlines from several fairly recent publications, media publications, newspaper publications that are illustrative of the prevalence of gun violence and gun violence exposure in the city of New Orleans, right? And the residents, both from children up to and through adults, the range in which gun violence is affecting and impacting the lives of New Orleans residents is. So in addition to these instances that we are understanding the prevalence of gun violence in the city, we also have public health and research in other disciplines and areas that are aligned with understanding, or rather, that help us to understand sort of the picture specifically around the ways in which youth are exposed to firearm violence in particular across the country. So not just in looking at New Orleans, but sort of taking a broader view and looking at what does youth exposure to firearm violence look like across the nation. And in looking at some recent statistics from recent examinations of this, we see that over this period, a recent period from 2019 to 2022, the firearm death rate among children and adolescents in particular increased by 46% over that time period. And recent increases in firearm deaths were primarily driven by gun assaults, which accounted for 2 out of 3 firearm deaths among children and adolescents in 2022 in particular. And gun assault deaths among children and adolescents have increased over the past decade, so over a 10-year period, from 54% to 66%. And then also in 2022 in particular, 27% of those firearm deaths were due to suicides, whereas 5% were accidental. So the balance of that percentage were either non-accidental deaths or deaths related that could be classified as homicide. We also see in examining statistics that is rooted in, particularly in public health investigations, that Black children and adolescents have particular vulnerability when it comes to exposure to firearm violence. So looking at some recent statistics around Black youth exposure in 2022, we saw that the rate of firearm deaths among Black youth in particular was 12.2 per 100,000, and that this was substantially higher than that of other racial and ethnic groups, 6 times higher than that of white youth of the same age in particular. Additionally, from 2018 to 2022, the rate of we see a doubling in the rate of firearm deaths among Black youth, and also an increase by 73% among Hispanic and Latina youth. So we do see particular vulnerability for Black youth and then Hispanic and Latina youth as another racial and ethnic minoritized group that is experiencing disproportionate exposure to firearm violence. In addition to police violence, we also see racial and ethnic disparities and differences in exposure to police violence as another form of violence that is uniquely affecting racially and ethnically minoritized children and adolescents. So we see statistical evidence showing that Black adolescents and young adults or emerging adults remain overrepresented in their exposures to police violence, both in school-based settings as well as in their neighborhoods and communities. We see evidence that Black boys and girls tend to have just overall more contact with police and law enforcement officers in comparison to their white peers, and that adolescent police contact, both direct or indirect, is associated with a range of negative developmental outcomes in these youth, inclusive of academic outcomes, emotional, social outcomes, psychological and physiological outcomes as well. So if we look at sort of the impact of exposure across both firearm violence and police violence and its impact on children, adolescents, and young adults, we see negative impacts across both areas of psychological outcomes, specifically if we look narrowly at mental health outcomes, but as well as developmental outcomes associated with educational attainment as well. So it suggests a need to understand better how young people's, particularly racially and ethnically minoritized young people, children, adolescents, and young adults, how are they navigating and coping with overwhelming exposures to firearm and police violence? What factors weigh in to increase risk of exposure or mitigate the risk of exposure and its impact on developmental outcomes, and what factors may be protective? So the larger study that the current study we're discussing and we'll share today is situated within the Enrichment to Empowerment study, which aimed to investigate those previous questions around risk factors, protective factors that are particularly relevant for racially and ethnically minoritized youth who tend to disproportionately have exposure to multiple forms of violence, inclusive of firearm violence and police violence. And in the overall Enrichment to Empowerment study, we had two aims in order to understand and evaluate the impact of a youth violence prevention intervention at the individual level as well as at the community level and its impact on particular outcomes. Outcomes related to exposures to violence, but also outcomes related to sociopolitical development and the ways in which that can act as a coping mechanism as well as a protective factor for young people who experience exposures to multiple forms of violence. So the current study is situated within the larger study in terms of the ways in which we are trying to understand the risk and protective factors at the community level for young people's exposures to these multiple forms of violence and its impact on particular psychological, educational, and socio-political developmental outcomes. So what you see in this blue box really situates us in the study that we're going to discuss today, where we specifically wanted to investigate and understand gender as well as racial differences in gun beliefs, access, as well as experiences of violence among young people who are in particular experiencing high rates of firearm violence.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and take us through the methods section. In terms of just the ethics approval and some of the background for the study, first of all, it was approved by the IRB here at Tulane. And these data come from a 20-minute survey that was delivered online through Qualtrics. All the participants needed to agree to either a consent form if they were 18 or older, or an assent form in order to enter into the survey. And parental consent was waived for minor participants per the IRB's determination. And for compensation, the participants received a $40 e-gift card if they completed the entire survey, or if they completed at least part of it, they received a $20 e-gift card. So for our sample and recruitment, the recruitment methods were pretty wide-reaching. So we used listservs, emails, so snowball sampling, and then also social media beginning in July of last year. And anyone was eligible if they lived in New Orleans and they were aged 14 to 24. So those were the only eligibility criteria. And in terms of the demographics of the final sample, these data represent 276 youth. Their median age is 17 years old. A little over half of them are cisgender, meaning they're non-transgender girls. 40% were cisgender boys, and then 5% were trans, meaning that they do not identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, and they could be any gender. So they could be trans girls, trans boys, and some were also non-binary or third gender. About a third of the sample were white, 30% indicated that they were Black, 10% indicated that they were Asian, and then 9% were either Native, Indigenous, or MENA, meaning Middle Eastern or North African. So running through the scales on the survey in terms of the outcome measures. So we measured gun beliefs with a single item, which is, I would feel safer if more people living in my community had guns. And they selected on a 4-point scale ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And we dichotomized the responses for our logistic regression analysis such that 0 corresponded to the strongly disagree and disagree responses, and 1 corresponded to strongly agree and agree. We also measured perceived ease of gun access, which we will, shorten to gun access likely throughout the presentation. And we also measured that with a single item, which was, how easy do you think it would be to get a gun if you wanted one? And participants again selected from 4 options on a 4-point scale ranging from almost impossible to very easy. Responses were dichotomized such that 0 corresponded to almost impossible or very difficult responses, and 1 represented those who selected either fairly easy or very easy. For our exposure variables, we first of all measured direct gun violence with 2 items that were yes or no from Brennan's 2007 exposure to violence scale. And the items asked if they had been either shot or shot at but not actually wounded in the past 6 months. So that was for direct gun violence. Indirect gun violence asked the same 2 items, but the question stem asked if they had witnessed someone else, right, either be shot or shot at in the past 6 months. And then the final 2 exposure variables are direct police violence and indirect police violence. These were also measured with 6 items from the Wilditch scale. And for direct police violence, we asked these 6 yes or no items. And a sample item is, has a police officer in the past 6 months hit, punched, kicked, dragged, beat, or otherwise used physical force against you? And the indirect violence, police violence measures asked the same 6 items, except they were asking about either a close friend or a family member instead of the respondents. So a sample item is, has a police officer in the last 6 months engaged in non-physical aggression towards a close friend or family member, including threatening, intimidating, stopping them without probable cause, or using slurs. In terms of our analysis, we started out using just logistic regression on SAS to explore associations between gun beliefs and gun access, and then all those 4 violence exposures. We also ran a full multivariate model with all the types of violence and all the exposures, and these were adjusted for age, race, and gender. And then we also ran an effect modification by gun access in the gun beliefs exposure relation. And so on to some results. So just starting out with descriptive statistics, looking at gun beliefs, we found that a slight majority of the overall sample endorsed negative gun beliefs, meaning that they said that they did not believe that gun ownership would make the community safer. We also looked at beliefs by racial group, and there were some differences. Black and Latina youth were more likely to hold negative gun beliefs, whereas white, Asian, and the other category, meaning so the MENA and the Native youth were more likely to hold positive gun beliefs. We did not find any differences by age or gender. And then looking at perceived ease of gun access, we found that 57% believe that it would be easy or very easy to get a gun. So pretty remarkable, almost 60%. But we did not find any differences by gender, age, or race. So also a very interesting finding. Looking in terms of descriptive statistics for the violence exposure, different types of violence exposure. So for direct gun violence exposure, about 44% of the sample experienced some kind of direct gun violence exposure, meaning that they were either shot or shot at. For indirect gun violence, direct police violence exposure and indirect police violence exposure, the participants reported approximately one experience of each of these, or rather one experience of indirect gun violence, 2 experiences of direct police violence exposure or indirect police violence exposure. Looking at the positive gun beliefs and the violence exposure, we used chi-squares and t-tests to sort of look at the differences between those with positive gun beliefs and negative gun beliefs. And we found that those with positive gun beliefs also had higher levels of direct and indirect gun violence exposure. So those who are more likely to believe that guns will keep their community safe are also those who had more direct and indirect gun violence experiences. Those who had positive gun beliefs also had more experiences of direct and indirect police violence exposure. And they also had 5.6 times higher likelihood of positive gun beliefs among those who had direct gun violence exposure. So overall, more beliefs about guns keeping the community safer are associated with having either direct or indirect gun violence or police violence exposure. In terms of gun beliefs or positive gun beliefs and police violence exposure, there was a 76% increase for each direct violence, police violence exposure event. We found an 82% increase in positive gun beliefs for each indirect police violence exposure event. And we also found that the magnitude, the direction, and the significance remained even after accounting for age, gender, and race. And of course, because we did also have gun access as one of sort of the main things we were looking at, but we did not actually find any significant associations between any forms of violence exposure and perceived ease of gun access. So it is important to note that. So for our full multivariate model, we found that all violence exposure types were associated with more positive gun beliefs. We also found that direct firearm violence exposure played the largest role in gun beliefs. So that means either being shot or shot at. Only direct firearm violence exposure remains significant after considering other forms of exposure, which again sort of highlights how significant it is to either be shot or shot at in terms of what we're looking at in this study. And then finally, we found that there was a 3 times greater likelihood of positive gun beliefs for youth exposed to greater levels of direct firearm violence exposure. And now on to the effect modification results. So we examined whether perceived ease of gun access could have modified the effect of gun beliefs on violence exposure. As in, with the full sample among the youth with a high gun access, direct violence exposure was most strongly associated with high gun beliefs. We have some odds ratios there for you. Among youth with lower gun access, indirect police violence exposure was most strongly associated with high gun beliefs, although it was just marginally significant. Then we also examined effect modification by gender and race in the full models. And while the interaction terms were significant, our stratified analyses were only possible for those with at least 30 observations. So that's the cis boys and cis girls. We did not have enough to look at the trans youth on their own. For the cis boys, indirect police violence was associated marginally with high gun beliefs. And then among the cis girls, direct gun violence was significantly associated with beliefs, with gun beliefs, with a more than 5-fold likelihood of higher gun beliefs for girls with greater exposure to direct gun violence. And then finally, the effect modification results by race. So starting with the Black youth, direct gun violence was also most strongly associated with high gun beliefs. For the Latina youth, indirect gun violence exposure was most strongly associated with high gun beliefs, while among the white youth, indirect police violence exposure was most significantly associated with high gun beliefs. So pretty interesting that for each of these different racial groups, there are different violence exposures that are most significantly associated with them.
So just to sort of recap the main findings from the study is that we observed that all forms of violence exposure we measured, so firearm violence, or direct and indirect firearm violence exposure, as well as direct and indirect police violence exposure, were associated with stronger endorsement of gun ownership for safety in our sample. Positive gun beliefs were also 3 times more likely for young people who were exposed to direct firearm violence, while positive gun beliefs were associated with different forms of violence exposure among Black, white, and Latina youth, suggesting that there may be some differences in experiences within communities and with experiences related to firearm violence as well as police violence across these different racial and ethnic groups. And then finally, we observed overall no associations between the relative ease of getting access to a firearm and the different forms of violence exposure. We will note that even with these really interesting and compelling findings, there were some limitations of note. We did engage a cross-sectional sample, which limits our ability to be able to draw conclusions that are related to age or development or stage of development. We also, this isn't up here, but we also engaged a correlational approach, which also limits our ability to be able to draw any conclusions related to causality in those relationships between violence exposure and gun beliefs and access. Also, we solely used self-report measures, so we have to acknowledge sort of the limitations and biases associated with self-reports on these constructs. We also had a lower representation of gender minorities, right, which limit our ability to be able to explore and observe, or rather investigate gender differences in violence exposure and its relationship to gun beliefs and access for gender minoritized youth, right? So our sample sizes for gender minoritized groups was too low in order to be able to examine them with sufficient statistical power. And then finally, we didn't include a measure of gun carrying or actual gun use or violence perpetration, right? Which we know are important factors in understanding or getting a fuller and complete understanding in between the relationships that we did observe in firearm, direct and indirect experiences with firearm and police violence and gun beliefs and access. Nevertheless, we do believe that our findings have relevant implications for practice and policy, particularly as it relates to understanding young people's exposures to multiple forms of violence, particularly firearm violence and police violence, and the impact or influence that that has on their beliefs about the use of firearms to promote safety, right? So our findings have implications in terms of thinking about prevention programs that promote young people's feelings of safety, right? So if in this study, we observe that young people believe that having a firearm is associated with making them feel safe. So prevention programs should aim to sort of examine and engage with that sort of thinking and approach around why young people think firearms are what is the tool that increase feelings of safety in order to be able to engage and explore other protective factors and community-based and individual level factors that may indeed work better to promote feelings of safety within their neighborhoods. And so youth programs that are aiming for building connections, such as youth sports, mentorship, civic engagement, and other positive youth development programs, have the opportunity to engage other mechanisms and other strategies and approaches that we know work to promote feelings of safety as well as actual safety for youth that are living in communities that are overwhelmingly experiencing these forms of violence. Oops. We also thought about the policy implications of our findings, right? And what this means for policies from the local level to the national level around gun safety, gun access, and particularly as it concerns how young people are thinking about and engaging with firearms and using them to promote and facilitate their own sense of safety. And we thought about specifically policies from the local to the national level that focus on investing in community-led initiatives, that focus on particularly gun violence prevention, that again sort of tap into positive youth development approaches like mentorship programs, conflict mediation, restorative justice and restorative practice programs, and other youth development activities and initiatives. We also thought that our findings had implications for policies that are focused on implementing public health campaigns that aim to educate parents, guardians, and other significant adults in the lives of young people that will aim to reduce the risk of teenage and adolescent and young adults' access to firearms, as well as the focusing on the importance of responsible gun ownership and gun storage. And the other policy implication we wanted to lift up was policies that are about funding additional research on gun violence, particularly focusing on the impact of firearms, beliefs, access, as well as firearm use behaviors in young people, and with a specific focus on young people who live in communities and contexts that are disproportionately affected by these forms of violence. We thank you for listening and for your time, and we welcome questions and discussion around the study that we presented today. We did want to share the citation to the article that gives more detail on the study, as well as acknowledging the CDC, the Division of Injury and Violence Prevention that funded the research that we talked about today. I'm going to stop the screen share so that we can have discussion and questions without that.
Thanks so much, y'all. I do have a question. I'm just curious kind of where you guys go next with this data.
I think I'll start, Lolita, and I'd love to hear your thinking on this as well. I think for me, what was really interesting to me in the finding were two things, right? That racial ethnic difference in terms of the relationship between direct versus indirect exposures to firearm violence and police violence and its association with their beliefs around using firearms and as sort of a tool to promote safety, right? So, for example, we observed that for Black youth in particular, it was their direct exposure to firearm violence, right? That was associated with, more positive beliefs around firearm, the use of firearms to promote safety. So kind of what's next for me, I think of that in terms of kind of what's next in terms of using research as a tool to understand that more, right? What is happening for Black youth in particular, Latino youth in particular, white youth in particular, in their communities in terms of their exposures to firearm and police violence and its connection to their beliefs about having access to firearms themselves to promote safety, right? Also, along with that, what was interesting to me was white youths, what was associated with their increased positive beliefs around around firearms to promote safety was indirect police violence, right? So knowing of someone or witnessing someone's exposure to police violence. So for me, that suggests, okay, we need to dig a little bit further to understand these differences across racial and ethnic groups of youth and their experiences with these types of violence. I think it also, for me, makes me think about, sort of, again, the programmatic, practice-based and policy implications, right? I think we already know and understand, like there is, we're in a New Orleans context, which I think is a particular context in which we did this study that we should think about and talk about. So we saw this in our data, right? There weren't any racial differences, right, in certain types of exposure. And I think it's because in New Orleans, there's a city where there is overwhelming exposure, or rather prevalence of these forms of violence, right? Both firearm violence and police violence. But I do think there is opportunity in these findings to explore the ways in which those different forms of violence are being experienced by racial and ethnic groups in order to think about how do we construct violence intervention and prevention programs that are serving youth from these different racial and ethnic minority groups to understand, what actually are the areas of violence exposure that are particularly leading them to think, okay, I need to get a gun in order to stay safe, right? So I hope I started to answer that question to some degree. I'd love to hear Lolita's thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Dr. Francois just shared. And I also think for me, as someone who, my background before I started here at Tulane was, I'm from a developmental psychology background. I know Dr. Francois is as well. But My original research that I did as a PhD student looked at media literacy and critical media literacy, which some people sort of conceptualize as a form of kind of critical consciousness, right? Which is this idea that was popularized by Pablo Freire, saying that anyone who is from any kind of oppressed or marginalized group, particularly youth, needs to be educated about that oppression so that they can be moved to action. And so critical consciousness, for me, critical media literacy, when I was doing that, this idea that people understand that what they're watching is constructed, that it's not just for entertainment, that it has values and is laden with values, is connected to socio-political development, right? Which is a whole range of beliefs about the ability to make change. And the cool thing about this survey, which I had no hand in developing, this is Dr. Francois' project, but they also measured it's ethnic identity, and I believe there's a socio-political or a critical consciousness scale. Now, we did kind of a lot of preliminary analyses. We decided to focus on firearm violence for this paper, but there's some cool findings related to critical consciousness. And so for me, the next step is kind of thinking about how would these results potentially change if we are thinking about young people who are very aware that, there are political structures and institutions that are responsible for widespread oppression. And is it possible that positive gun beliefs, this belief that guns make us safer, could that potentially be negatively related to critical consciousness? Is that only the case for Black youth? Because the history of, the Black radical tradition, which is less prevalent now, but there's a history of Black people learning that, there is institutional racism, right? And that, we have to sort of, work together to kind of fight back against those structures. So maybe ethnic identity and critical consciousness would be negatively related to positive gun beliefs, or maybe it would strengthen them, right? Because historically, guns did keep Black communities safer from racial terrorism, right? So it's so complex. There's so much really cool stuff in this survey. Again, we made some decisions about, well, what's a paper where these results have not been reported on, even though there's a ton of firearm violence literature. These are really novel findings. And so we're really fortunate it found a home at Youth and Society, the journal, really quickly, but there's more to do. And now that we have people like Andrea Daviera, who's on the call, who also has done so much really cool stuff around organizing. I know she and I have chatted about like critical consciousness measures and stuff. So we'll see what happens next, but that's kind of what I immediately sort of thought of. And it's kind of something, I chatted, thank you, Dr. Francois. It's something that, I've chatted with her about, and I also talked a little bit with Dr. Francois about too. So we'll see what happens next with that. And thank you for that question, Hope.
Thanks. I really appreciate both of those responses, and I feel so excited to see kind of where this leads next. Do we have any other questions from the folks joining us today?
So I have a question. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. There's sort of a narrative that you're telling here about causality, and I'm a little uncomfortable with it, in that if a youth has been directly exposed, if a Black youth has been directly exposed to violence, police violence, correct? That they're more likely to have positive views about firearms keeping them safe.
It's gun violence, not police violence, just to let you know. Direct exposure to gun violence.
If they've had direct exposure to gun violence, they're more likely to, at least this is what you're saying, they're more likely to have positive views about guns will keep them safe. I guess I think it's the opposite. And until, I don't know if you could use vignettes to bring it into the lab, and maybe that's just not the area where you're moving towards, but I think if you have positive views about that guns can keep you safe, that you're more likely to find yourself in the middle of an altercation or a disagreement or a conflict where guns are involved. Also, if you think guns can keep you safe, you might be enamored with guns. You might think they're really cool, really slick, really make you an important person. I just, and then you had some arrows that sort of, I think might have made someone think that there's a causality there, but I don't think there is right now. So what do you think about that? Could you bring it in? Could you maybe have these youth read vignettes about a situation? Is there some way to get at that causal link? I guess that's my long-winded question. Thank you.
So I'll start, Lolita, if you're okay with that, or okay. Thank you for that question, Paul. I like that question, like particularly around sort of using vignettes or other approaches or methods to really dig deeper into understanding what does this sense of, what's really underneath this sense of young people feeling guns make them safe, right? Or feel safer, right? So I do think, going back to your question, Hope, that is a important next step for this study and this work, is that we engage other methods to really get underneath that, to understand what is that belief, and what is that about? What are the components of it? What are the factors that create it, right, or contribute to that belief? So I think that's one thing I want to say in response to your question. The other thing is, I think your point is well taken around sort of the visualization of the relationship, that we definitely don't intend to suggest a causal, right? Because we didn't design the study to test causation. We didn't use the, analytic approaches to test causation or be able to draw conclusions. Rather, we do see an association, right? The relationship is correlational. And because of that, we don't know the direction, right? We don't. One absolutely could precede the other, right? We don't know. And to your point, or an additional comment to your point, is that I do think that is a next direction for this work, and thinking about how do we design the study to engage that question of causality. I'll stop there, and Lolita, you can jump in with a response as well.
Thank you so much. I want to echo everything you said. I appreciate the question because, yes, there's no causality confirmed, hopefully not implied. These are binary logistic regressions. So I'm not going to repeat what Sam just said. What I will say, though, is that to your point, it's so important to, and this is the beauty of public health, and something I just didn't get from my psych training, we have to zoom out. We cite several studies related to positive gun beliefs in the paper. There are so many studies showing that this is not a Black youth thing. This is not a Latina youth thing. This is an American people thing. Many people in many parts of the country, the American South in particular, over COVID and the George Floyd related uprisings, they found that American adults were more likely to indicate that they kept their guns more handy because of potential bandits or uprising related break-ins, right? So this is not a, kids think guns are cool. This is an American culture thing. And I think this gets at policy practice implications too, right? Let's pretend that we do find that just, being threatened by a gun or witnessing a gun makes people more likely to believe that guns do keep them safe. Well, what's next? Because we need to be realistic about the political landscape. You know, guns are not getting taken away, period. It's not happening, right? The youth, I think, are correct in thinking, the majority of them said it would be easy for me to get a gun. I actually found that so surprising because I don't know where I would go. I guess the gun store, but they know. So I love your idea about qualitative data because it's so important. But no, we are not trying to get at causality. I do think it's important, though, to situate these data within this larger context. We are in the American South. We're in a very high firearm violence city, one of the highest. And then our socio-political context right now, right? So it is totally not specific to this sample. They're swimming in it. Guns are in the movies, guns are on the news, their friends are getting threatened with them, and then 42% of them said that they had been threatened, right, with a gun, been shot or shot at and not hit. So just wanted to, say that, but I hear your concerns because it is not our intention to imply that causality. We do need a lot more to dig in and understand direction.
Thank you for your answers, both of you. You're so brilliant, you're so smart, and it's such an important study. I often ask myself, I'm in Memphis now, but I'm a Tulane grad. And I often ask myself when I see someone out in the public with a firearm, I'm in Tennessee, when I see them in the mall with a gun, do I feel safer? Or when I see them in a Waffle House, or when I see them in a bank, do I feel safer? Personally, generally for me, the answer is no.
Yeah, I think it's for themselves, right? They probably feel safer, but the people around them don't feel safer. And Lolita, thank you for your comment because, if we think about like a historical context and what this country was built on, we have an amendment to bear arms for a reason. And so that is very much like an American principle that you need to protect yourself by having a gun.
Thank you all. We'd love to take any other questions before we end our presentation today.
May I make, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in with one thought. First of all, just really want to thank you both, Dr. Moss, Dr. Francois. This is really insightful and super important, interesting. Something that came to mind was this qualitative study I did back in Chicago that found that as it relates to how youth in Chicago were navigating, chronically dangerous spaces, they sort of viewed things like gang violence and police violence as very similar threats, essentially. Really identifying them both in similar terms of like needing to watch out or be careful or modify how they looked or acted around both of these sources of people in how they practice safety. I'm really wondering if future research could look at some interactions by like gun violence by police violence. I wonder how those two things are actually something that would interact to specifically also predict things like views about guns, because often I think we see that young people in these scenarios, they're facing both gang violence, gun violence, and violence from the police, and they feel the need to carry weapons because they don't know how else to feel safe. So that's just my 2 cents, and just I would love to work on that, low key with you both. So keep me in mind. Thank you.
Well, I think, I would say high key. That sounds excellent. I know myself, I'm going to be taking a hierarchical linear modeling class. I don't have any SEM experience, but SEM would also be an excellent tool. There are so many things we could do, but absolutely, yes, we should certainly collaborate on that paper. So thank you so much for that comment. And I will read, I'll read Tim's chat comment really quick, and then let's hear from Dr. Francois. She has a response to that. If other people have guns, then I better get a gun. It's definitely a common narrative I've heard in my own life. Everyone thinks they're going to be the quote good guy with the gun. Exactly. Yes, and that narrative gets pushed, I think, in our media. I'm always going to return to media because that's what happens when you study media exposure and influence for 6 years. And then Kamal Brown says, I agree. Anecdotally, most of the people I know personally that own guns got them after an experience of some type of violence. So this makes total sense to me. Yes. And then before I stop talking, I do just want to say that this is also an indictment somewhat of our own criminal justice system, because if we're looking at clearance rates in terms of finding the people or any kind of, I don't want to say retribution, but there are really not good ways that our system protects victims of violence. Right. And I'm not even saying that from a more people need to be arrested perspective at all, because those are not my personal beliefs. But my beliefs are there are no ways that victims and survivors are really being taken care of. And then Dr. Francois, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you for that last comment, Dr. Moss, because I want to connect it to a comment made earlier and more than once, is that is connected to sort of it's in the cultural value structure, the American cultural value structure, that this is what makes us safe. This is the tool we use for protection, to protect ourselves, our bodies, beings, and our property, right? And that I don't need to overstate the point that's been made. It's a part of the culture, right? So that is situated within the weaknesses and limitations of the criminal legal systems. I guess the thought I'm having is there's so much I feel like we are moving full steam and full speed ahead with, in terms of our role as researchers, right, to interrogate and investigate through our research tools gun violence, right? This phenomena of growing gun violence and firearm violence, and with that police violence as well, in our communities across this country. But I also, there's a part of me that feels like, and I'm coming to this in this conversation, that we might not slow down, but lift up other methods and approaches that really lean more into qualitative approaches. Because I think what folks are saying, I'm reading in the chat, anecdotal evidence, right? The people around me or my own beliefs, we have tools to document and be able to bring that into the narrative, the public health narrative around the epidemic of firearm violence and exposure in this country. I arguably will say we are very limited in the conclusions we can draw at this point. We are. And if we break it down by any demographic, in this paper, we focused on young people, we disaggregated and saw some things based on race and ethnicity, but look at how much we don't know and understand about young people's gun beliefs, their access. We have an understanding anecdotally, but systematically, we still have a lot of work to do. And I'm becoming more and more convinced that work has to be qualitative. I think that's the response or point I want to make at this point.
And I'll just read Paul's comment from the chat, to close us out. Our culture of guns depresses me. I'm particularly interested in gun violence at schools. If you get a chance, please see the internet resources promulgated by Sandy Hook Promise. Be blessed all. Yes, thank you so much for that comment. And thank you all so much, everyone, for being here today. This is a great, a really, really great discussion. So I'm so grateful for the time in the space. So thank you.
And Sam said lifting up the Sandy Hook Promise. Thanks so much.
Yeah, all of the work that they are doing and have done is really powerful stuff.
Thank you all so much for joining us today and for discussing your results and just discussing your analysis. Looking so forward to seeing kind of what comes next. And yeah, I hope everyone has a great rest of your Friday. Enjoy your weekend. Thanks everyone.
Thank you all.